Bob Kagan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and an old friend of mine, and has caused some considerable debate with your latest piece in the New Republic. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Joe. And I don't think if Joe were here, he and I would have a lot of controversy, because generally we tend to see the world in similar ways. But I'm going to look at the issue maybe from a somewhat different perspective. I mean, Joe's position ultimately is that democracy ought to win because it's a better form of government. And I think, you know, as an Enlightenment person myself and as an American, I do think democracy is a better form of government. I think it clearly does appeal to, as Frank has said and others have said for hundreds of years, it appeals to basic needs and elements of human nature for recognition, for autonomy, etc. But I guess the historian in me has become increasingly skeptical that we should be confident of the democratic future. My father, who's an ancient historian and was particularly a historian of ancient Greece and Athens in particular, always told me that democracy was a very rare and fragile flower. And historically, that has certainly been true. And I think that we have been living in a kind of blessed era, but it is not anything like what we've seen throughout human history. So therefore, we've come up with a teleological explanation for why democracy is so widespread. If you're Frank, it's the shorthand of Hegelian dialectic, with the best idea ultimately winning. If you were a Whig historian in England, you would have said this was the product of centuries of evolution, etc. And it's very comforting to us to think that we have reached a pinnacle, that this is the consequence of human progress. I wonder whether instead it is just a configuration of power, a set of circumstances which may or may not last. And that is that's kind of where I feel like I am today. And for me, the interesting question, because I was talking to Mark Plattner about this before we came up, I mean, the democracy promotion business, the study of democracy promotion, tends to focus, properly so, on what's going on inside societies. You know, we have gone through, you know, phases of modernization theory and what have you, and emendations of that, which focus on the evolution that societies take. Again, kind of a teleological notion that says you have to go through certain phases to get to democracy, which hasn't always proven true. But whether it has or it hasn't, my focus, I have to say, tends to be more at the geopolitical level. And I am inclined to believe that it is not enough to have the pieces in place in governments in nations around the world, or in city-states around the world even, for the evolution of democracy. That whether that evolution actually takes place or not depends on the configuration of power at the top level among the great powers who wield inordinate influence, not only on international relations, but on the internal evolution of societies whom they do have influence over. You know, going back to the ancient world, when Athens and Sparta were in competition with one another, Athens went around setting up little democracies in all the city-states. Sparta went around setting up little oligarchies in all the city-states. Athenians felt more comfortable with democrats and knew that they would have good relations with democrats who were threatened by oligarchs, and Sparta felt quite the contrary. And so it was not just a geopolitical struggle between Athens and Sparta, it was also a struggle over you know, what kind of political evolution was going to take place in these city-states. And by the way, as my father has explained to me many times, it was not because the Athenians were interested in promoting democracy as an ideal necessarily, but they thought it was in their interest to do so. And I think you could see that kind of trend occurring throughout history. More recently, if you look at the 19th century, and particularly I've taken a look a little bit at the revolutions of 1848. There are many reasons to think that several European countries, including the German territories were ripe, in fact, for liberal change in 1848. That they really had gone through a process, and that Germany would have gone through a very different subsequent history if the liberals / socialists / what have you had actually triumphed in 1848. I don't think it's clear that the reason they didn't triumph was because Germany, or whatever Germany was at that time, was unready. They didn't triumph because their revolution was crushed by the efforts of the Eastern autocracies, particularly Russia, while the one country that might have had a sympathetic view toward what was happening on the continent, Britain, for geopolitical reasons having a lot to do with inadequate strength, really allowed that crushing to occur. And so there was not a birth of liberal democracy that there might have been in 1848. Instead, Germany in particular went on a very different course, toward autocracy of the Bismarckian variety, and took another course internationally, as we now know too. But things don't have to get there just because the conditions are ripe. And so for me, the question really is, in the current circumstance, how much of the enormous spread of democracy that we witnessed, especially beginning in the late 1970s and going through the full, what Sam Huntington referred to as the third wave, how much of that was just natural evolution, and how much of it was shaped by the fact that the strongest power in the world, and really at that moment sort of increasingly strong, although it didn't seem so perhaps at the beginning, produced a situation where democracies, because it was a democracy, where democracies spread. And Huntington, who, like any good intellectual, changed his mind 4 or 5 times over the course of his life, but if you go back and read his book on the third wave, he gives the United States quite a lot of responsibility for that trend. Not only in terms of what we refer to as democracy promotion, sort of positive efforts, but in many respects, more importantly, in the prevention of overthrows of democracy. He cites, I think, at least 20 occasions where the United States government prevented coups, particularly in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, that might have led to the overthrow of democracy. So merely by sort of intervening at a critical moment to prevent a reversal of democracy, in some of these countries, in many of these countries, democracy really took root and kept going. In Latin America, it seems to me, if you could look at a pattern over many, many decades and say that a lot of these countries were never going to be permanent democracies. They were going to go through cycles. Cycles where you have authoritarian strongman regimes, as Joe says, then it's overthrown, you have a period of democracy fails for whatever reason, and then you return to autocracy. These cycles could theoretically go on forever. What happened was, I think the United States, for its own reasons, some of which were idealistic, some of which were pragmatic, stepped in and broke the cycle. So that instead of going back and forth between autocracy and democracy, we really have a pretty good situation in Latin America, all things being equal. But would that have been the case if the United States had not stepped in? I think that the way I'm looking at the current situation, and by the way, let me hasten to add, this is not all about the United States. You'd have no democracy in any country if the people didn't want it. And where it fails, it's not necessarily the United States' fault. I'm talking about, on balance, that it's no coincidence that we've gone from, maybe a dozen democracies on the eve of World War II to whatever it is right now, 114. I don't know, what's the number, David? You should know that. If you don't know the number, you're fired. That's it. That's over. Okay. He has to turn to his source over here. But anyway, over 100 democracies, and yes, there's more nations now, so I understand that. But even so, it's a tremendous explosion of democracy. And this gets to this question, but if it is it really true that all things being equal, democracy necessarily wins? I'm not sure. It seems to me that we have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that while democracy appeals to things that human beings want, authoritarianism must also. And I think history suggests that there are appealing aspects. Whether it's, we say the authoritarians are stirring up nationalism, well, it's there to be stirred up. A feeling of community, a feeling of people acting as one, and especially after disillusionment with democratic experiments. I mean, there's no question the Germans were disillusioned by the experience of Weimar, or that Russians were disillusioned by the experience of the Yeltsin years of the 1990s, for all kinds of perfectly legitimate reasons. Which means that in those situations, authoritarianism also had its appeal. In the same way that, I don't know what pundit, the quiz for the day is guess the pundit that Joe Jaffe was, quote, was it Friedman or was it Fareed? It could have been, Fareed recently wrote a paean to Chinese wonderfulness. I don't remember where it appeared, but anyway. You know, this argument existed in the 30s also. You had Charles Lindbergh and his wife writing great paeans to the great, forget about Stalin, we're talking about Hitler and Nazi Germany, which was really making things work in a way that Americans admired. And part of the admiration was because of the obvious failures of democracy in the West. The idea, as Frank says in his Wall Street Journal piece, that democracies are, one of the reasons that authoritarianism is advancing is because democracies are not doing a good job at home. Well, what's new? You know, that's not new. The democracies have frequently failed to deliver in one way or another. So the struggle is on, I guess, is my point. And the struggle is eternal. It doesn't go away. The longest running struggle in recent history, and I'm talking about, as a historian, recent means several hundred years, the recent struggle is not between communism and capitalism, or between communism and democracy, or even between fascism and democracy. The struggle that goes back certainly to the time of the American and French revolutions has been between autocracy and liberalism. That struggle has gone on, and it continues today. And it will, in my view, be shaped as much by the configuration of power at the high level as by any amount of democracy promotion efforts or economic changes or the movement of the Chinese population into the middle class and hitting whatever magic number. What's the magic number these days, David? I got to stop asking these questions. Anyway, some magic number.
I'm nodding off.
Yeah, I know. You're not even paying attention.
Just go on.
Is it time for me to stop? You know, that is really going to be, and then what the United States, which is, after all, the strongest democratic power in the world, decides to do in particular situations, and I'm going to end on this note. Yes, there are some areas of the world, some countries which may be beyond America's capacity to do anything about at any particular moment. Then there are those countries where the United States can have some influence. And I'm looking particularly at the question of Egypt, which clearly moved into a transition phase. Now, I don't know whether Egypt is supposed to be economically the perfect candidate for democratic modernization. Probably it isn't. But of course, we've seen many non-candidates for democratic modernization succeed in achieving democracy. But when the 30-year military dictatorship was overthrown in Egypt, clearly by a popular movement of diverse forces, clearly Egypt had reached that moment when the question was going to be, could it make a democratic transition or not? And this was one of those moments where the decisions of the power upon whom Egyptian authorities had long depended, i.e. the United States, had outsized influence over what decisions were made. And if you think back on the situation in the Philippines post-Marcos, the situation in South Korea when the military authorities were overthrown, and the United States then came in and was, I think, very sort of involved in ensuring that these military dictatorships were not succeeded by other military dictatorships. In the case of Egypt, I believe the United States took an extremely passive and cautious approach and missed the opportunity that was there. You can press me on this in Q&A. It's a complicated story, obviously, with 3 different successive types of Egyptian governments. In each case, I would say the United States put a higher priority on having someone to pick up the phone and talk to, having someone who would maintain the peace agreement with Israel, and above all, having a government that Israel could be comfortable with. I think that was the determining factor in American foreign policy at the end of the day. But suffice to say, that was one of those moments. And if you want to say, you know, what is happening to the authoritarian temptation, the temptation is always there. And for all we know, the more natural situation for human beings is, in fact, living under authoritarian rule. And that what we've been witnessing has been an aberration, has been a pushing against trend. If that's true, then it will only persist if we continue to push. Because I think the jungle will grow back otherwise. And we'll find that a lot of countries that we've gotten used to seeing as democracies will cease to be democracies. You know, even in Europe, on the continent of Europe, European democracy is not that old. And we can see signs in some parts of Europe, I think there's a lot of pressure for staying democratic, but we could see places where there's democratic retreat even in Europe. As I say, I'll end here, but it isn't all about what the United States does. I'm not claiming the United States has the answers. And by the way, the United States has certainly, throughout its history, behaved hypocritically and not supported its own principles and values as we have in Egypt. But I believe that the success or failure of democracy in the world writ large will ultimately depend on what the United States does and doesn't do.
All right.
Thank you.
This one's
Are any of these mine? Not
yeah,
oh.
I only had a little from that one. All right, if you're done asking me questions, let me ask you questions. The desire to be free, to have your human rights respected, to be allowed to speak out, believe in whatever you want to believe in, universal or not?
Yeah, they're universal, but they're not exclusive. Because then there are other desires. The desire to be protected. The desire to feel part of something larger than yourself. The sense that if everyone has what I want, the result is chaos. I mean, surely I think it has become ingrained, at least in many Russians' appreciation, that they may need something strong at the top. Otherwise, it's chaos and disaster. So all those, I guess what I'm saying is all those things that you just described are definitely there. But they're not the only things that are there.
But in some cases, let's say in the case of the 90s in Russia, we tended to describe that period as a time of democracy.
Yeah.
Do we wind up discrediting the notion of democracy at a time when, for most Russians, that was a very difficult period, dislocating, upsetting, they lost savings, and it was a time of weakness, a time that we were perceived to be taking advantage of them. How often do we make the mistake of describing things prematurely as democratic revolutions or democratic movements, and in the course of doing so, discredit the whole notion?
Well, I mean, I have a hard time not feeling that there was something inevitable in the Russian reaction, regardless of what we said or didn't say. They had the experience that they had. It was in a democratic system. There were elections. The leadership trumpeted their democratic credentials. So you know, much as I'd love to blame us for that, I think it just was what it was. In the same way that Weimar democracy discredited democracy for a lot of Germans, and not because Americans were running around, we were paying no attention practically whatsoever to what was going on in Germany in the 1920s. So, no, it's just a fact, I think, that democracy will sometimes be discredited by either itself or by circumstances. Then the question becomes, is there anything that we can do to nevertheless keep it from going off the tracks? In the case of big countries that are not dependent on the United States, in a way, I think it's always going to be very hard. And you know, just to round out the picture of what I was saying before, it's no accident that the countries where we have been most successful in fostering this movement toward democracy have either been under our occupation or dependent on the United States in some way. We've had very little success converting countries that were neither of those, that really in some respects were either adversaries or entirely outside the American orbit.
As you look at the various waves that Huntington describes, and given what you've said, would you single out certain administrations or policies that may be cross administrations that have made a difference either negatively or positively?
Well, I think the period that began in the Carter administration and then after a brief sort of obligatory rejection of the Carter's policies, an eventual adoption of the general thrust of Carter's policies in the Reagan years, I think had a great deal to do with the great expansion of democracy in that period. The sort of saying that in a fundamental way that the United States is not simply going to support every right-wing dictator that it has traditionally supported, led the United States to be what I think it often is for right-wing dictators, a very unreliable ally. Reagan, largely as a result of Elliott Abrams, who is, I suppose, no longer here right now, not only felt that we ought not to be doing that, but that in fact it was counterproductive in terms of the struggle against communism, since the dictators seem to be only promoting more rebellion, which is a situation I think we're now going to see in Egypt as well. But I think those two were particularly successful. I think that the Eisenhower and Nixon years were particularly unfortunate from that point of view. And again, and this is an interesting debate to be had, I think there's a correlation between whether the United States is in a global active mode or in a retrenchment mode. During periods of retrenchment, the United States frequently has historically looked around for reliable strongmen that it can, the Nixon Doctrine approach, the Shah of Iran, the Saudi government, Marcos, people that you feel like, we don't have to do anything, you keep it under control over there. I feel sort of glimmers of that in the president's West Point speech, where he talks about finding allies in the Middle East who can be sort of our surrogates in the war against terror. And those are not probably going to be democratic governments. So I think that, when we tend to be more activist, we tend to be less tolerant of allowing the dictatorships to just do their thing.
You talked about over the history of hypocrisy in the U.S. and its policy. And I think the phrase that best sums that up, well, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Has that kind of approach been a mistake? It was arguably more when there was an ideological struggle in the world taking place, but not necessarily. There's still some of that to this day.
Well, I think Roosevelt said that, well, I guess that was an ideological struggle too. But I mean, I think in the long run it has been a mistake. It was not conducive to the liberal world order that I think is in our interest. I think we made a mistake during the Cold War in which we felt not only that anyone who wasn't a sort of right-winger was therefore a communist working for the Soviet Union, and on the other side, that any dictator who claimed to be fighting communism was therefore our ally. I think, if you want to look at one of the sources of global hostility to the United States during that period, it was the support of dictators against popular will in some of these countries. And I think that proved to be a mistake. It's a mistake we're repeating in the Middle East, I believe now, and have for quite some time. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that anytime you're allied to a right-wing dictator, you have to immediately overthrow them, because obviously the world is what it is, and there will be circumstances in which you have to, sort of hold your, just hold your nose and do it. But I would say over the long run, that's not the appropriate strategy for us. And the Roosevelt example is an interesting example as well. The good neighbor policy was really just, we're not going to be meddling in the Latin America anymore with the intention which we had of actually trying to, teach them to elect good men, as Woodrow Wilson once said. But it really was, we're getting out. And now that we're getting out, you kind of keep a lid on things. And that's why Somoza was a son of a bitch, but he was our son of a bitch. Mm-hmm. It's usually, as I say, it's usually something that accompanies a general withdrawal of American influence overall.
Just one or two more, and then I'll open it up. In a number of cases around the world, we're seeing authoritarian regimes try to gin up some legitimacy by going through the motions of some democratic processes, at least a veneer of them. Elections, for example, which we largely know the outcomes of, but nevertheless they bother to, I don't know which one of those is yours, but they...
It's frightening to think one of them might be yours.
Yes, it is. But they go through these elections. How much at risk are we that they are using some parts of democracy, some elements of it, to further their own authoritarian hold on power?
You know, but it's the oldest trick in the book. I mean, that's not a new problem, and we just have to be, you know, smart enough and honest enough to know the difference, and that's why Freedom House exists. That's why all these democratic monitoring groups exist. When they have the integrity that they should have, they can say, yes, you held a democratic election, but no one else was really allowed to run, or yes, you had a democratic election, but you have complete monopoly of the media. And I think that we should be, you know, very open in decrying that. Now, in the case of Egypt, for instance, where both of those things were true, effectively there was only one person running, and the media was totally controlled, and they threw everybody else in jail, we should not be even using the word democracy to describe that. I mean, being democratic doesn't mean you're an idiot, you know, and
though you have a right to be an idiot.
But you have a right to be an idiot, exactly. Right. And so, you know, we ought to be able to see and call a rigged election when we see it.
You've written about this, Bob, it was a piece you did in the Post, and I guess you touch on it in the New Republic piece, the mood of the American public, which isolationism is a loaded term, but seems to be supporting the notion of disengaging, withdrawing, focusing on the problems here at home. We've seen this before. Is this a huge concern of yours?
It's a big concern, yeah. I mean, the question is, you know, Americans have for 100 years gone through cycles of activism followed by periods of retrenchment, and it's sort of understandable. You know, the American psyche is divided. We're schizophrenic. On the one hand, our ideals tend to be universal, therefore we sort of care about things. Trade leads us out into the world. Lots of things lead us out into the world. But no sooner are we out there, the price is high, and then we don't feel like doing that anymore, and most Americans think that they're just sitting here minding our own business, why is everybody bothering us? So we've gone through these sort of cycles of involvement followed by retrenchment. There's an excellent book out on this in the Cold War period by Steve Sestanovich, yep. Which I highly recommend. I think it's called The Maximalist, but basically it follows this period of... So where are we now? Are we in a sort of classic period of retrenchment, which, you know, if this is a sine wave, we're at the bottom of the sine wave and it's only a matter of time before the sine wave turns back up again, or have we moved into a different realm altogether? And the most obvious example of moving away from the cycle of activism followed by retrenchment is following World War I, another war that Americans were terribly disillusioned by. It led to a long, long decision to stay out of world affairs with the consequences that we know. Are we in a sort of post-Vietnam phase where you wind up electing Ronald Reagan 5 years later? Or are we in a post-Woodrow Wilson phase and it's 20 years and an attack on Pearl Harbor before America decides that Americans decide they need to get involved? My concern is that all the kind of theoretical, strategic rationale that kept Americans engaged after World War II, which revolved around communism and the threat of the Soviet Union. Then there were 25 years, I think we may have been just operating on the fumes from the Cold War, where you had very interventionist presidents, all of them, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. But whether it was just a matter of time before the fact that there was no communism and Soviet Union to keep Americans engaged, that we would move out of that cycle altogether. And, you know, my concern is that's where it is. My concern is right now, it's not just that Americans don't want to go to war with Syria. That's fine. These things are all difficult calls. It's that they're not sure why America is out there at all. They're not sure why we have alliances with, you know, with Poland, let alone with Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia. And I would be nervous about asking them what they think about Article 5 commitments to those countries right now. So that is my concern. And just as a final note on this question, absent some political leadership, like re-explaining it, I think they are likely to continue to drift in this direction until something pretty significant happens. In the 1930s, Hitler conquering Europe was not enough. I think it's worth remembering for the American people to decide that they really better get back in the game. And so, I'd hate to think what the contemporary analogy would have to be for that. So I hope we're not there. They do have the experience of global leadership, which they had not had in the 20s and 30s. But I think it's an open question.
In fact, we as an organization were founded in 1941 to confront the dangers of fascism, Nazism, communism, but also a sense of isolationism in the United States, that we could wall ourselves off from threats to freedom elsewhere. All right, let me throw it open. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. The gentleman right there we'll start with, and then we'll go there.
My name's Ken Davidson. I'm with the American Antitrust Institute. I'd like to make a comment on Jaffe's presentation, which I thought was very good, but left out an important element, and try and also bring it into the balance that Kagan has just given us. One thing that Jaffe did not mention is the importance of economic growth and where the impetus for growth in underdeveloped countries comes from. Namely, they borrow it, they steal it. I mean, this business of the Chinese stealing American economic secrets is not a secret. We stole to get our economy going. But to keep it going, you have to have a dynamic economy. The one thing you don't get in autocratic governments are dynamic economies. The antitrust system, as badly as it is done here or in Europe, does put that into the mix. And when we get growth through innovation, we have a very different profile for the entire world. It is why the world likes America, why we stand out, why Europe stands out. And then we see these little things that are blips, like the Japanese miracle or the Russian miracle, where you get short-term money by copying what's going on. But it doesn't persist because it's not a system. Our system is built on change. And if we can keep an economy growing, then the temptation to move to an autocratic system that can just take what we need and put it in is much less. There's a great book, and I'll finish.
Yep.
There's a great book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth by Benjamin Friedman, in which he says that freedom really depends on economic growth.
Thanks. Let me collect one or two others over here. Right there.
Hi, I'm Ira Strauss. I used to be with the Association to Unite the Democracies, and that's the hat I'll wear now, even though it's obsolete. I agreed with everything you said, Bob, until you got to Egypt, but I don't want to argue with you about Egypt. What I want to take up with you is the things you almost said or halfway said, which I think would change the balance of your conclusion somewhat. That America promoted democracy best in the areas where it held these areas as dependencies or under its predominant influence for a long period of time, partly by promoting democracy, but largely by their adaptation to the norms of our sphere and the ways and the sense of security that was provided. I think that's profoundly true. That, I think, changes the balance in how democracy is to be promoted. Another thing you said is the configuration of power on the global level is one of the most important determinants. What goes into that configuration of power? Is it only national powers? I want to bring up several examples you gave about Germany. There's Germany in 1848. There was no concrete West at the time. The only concrete Europe was the Holy Alliance or Concert of Europe, which was divided between a West and an East, but the West was not united in any way. It failed in Germany. Weimar Germany. The West was concretized to bring down the German autocracy, but it didn't remain united to guide the Weimar Germany. And the Weimar Germany was kept out of the West in a strategic sense and felt humiliated by its democracy. Bonn Germany was integrated into a concrete West that was formed after 1945. Same thing with Japan implicitly. The whole experience was totally different, not so much because we promoted democracy per se, although we did it, but because we gave them a home. Isn't that what happened for Eastern Europe after 1989? Isn't that why things are mostly going better, not to the exclusion of the promotion of democracy specifically, but the provision of a home? This leads me to suggest there will be two different conclusions, I'll conclude, on the global level. One is that where we can't provide a home, we really have to be distinguished not only between honest and dishonest democracies, we also have to distinguish radical or totalitarian democracies, which aren't entirely fraudulent, and we have to distinguish friends and enemies. That also is basic common sense, not to be fools, and maybe we shouldn't be promoting democracy in some cases where it's going to bring enemies to power. And we should take instead a view toward promoting global leadership of the West and the strategic consolidation of Western global leadership, even including some friendly authoritarian regimes and leaving some space for them in areas where we're not able to consolidate democracy as a plausible prospect. So that does change the conclusion in terms of democracy promotion.
Okay. Bob?
Somehow I think you were talking about Egypt in there. Where are the, I'm just curious, where are the friendly authoritarians we should be embracing? Oh, I see. Okay. So that's also Egypt. Okay. So this is, okay, so what you're really talking about is the Middle East, and I get that. By the way, I agree with 99% of what you said if the 1% is everything you're implicitly saying about the Middle East. Look, I don't think the Morsi government was an enemy of the United States. I don't even think the Morsi government was an enemy of Israel, really. I mean, if you look at what they actually did, they did not, in fact, break out of the treaty. They did not, in fact, become, and the most important thing about the Morsi government is that they didn't control the military, which gave us an opportunity, I think. And I think it was a mistake not to use our influence with the Morsi government to get them to behave better, and then also use our influence with the Egyptian military for them not to coup. And I think we could have lived with a democratic, I mean, we are going to have to, we have two choices in the Middle East. I'm not ignoring your question, but I'm most exercised by this question. And then I'm going to come back to your question. We have two choices, it seems to me, in the Middle East. We can attempt to support, when the opportunity arises, as it did in Egypt, something like Islamic democracy. Or we can just say, we're going to support every military regime in the region that promises to kill as many Islamists as it possibly can, which is the Egyptian government's policy. I don't know that, in which case, you know, I believe we're going to get the worst of all worlds. We're going to get Islamic radicalism run rampant, and we're going to lose these governments that we think are helping us. And we had a difficult, but nevertheless, I think, important route into what I think is was going to be inevitably this sort of interesting experiment of Islamism and democracy. I think we now are not, I'm not sure that option is left to us anymore, in which case we will certainly pursue the course that you're talking about. You know, whether that leads us to convert Egyptian military regime into democracy, I also am very skeptical about. On your question, I mean, obviously you're right, and I believe that the American economy in particular is going to do better in the long run, and maybe even in the short run and the medium run, than every other country in the world, including Europe, precisely because of the willingness to suffer through the consequences of change and adaptation. And we will always adapt. This is what we've proven time and again. We will always adapt better. My concern is, if we're talking about China, and this is also, what I have to say in response to Joe's argument, I'm sure that the Chinese economy is going to come a cropper at some point as a result of the nature of its government. I'm just not sure it's going to happen in a time period that is relevant to me or to my children, and that so much can happen in the interim, even as the Chinese economy begins to falter, or that the Chinese economy will falter in such a way that their answer will be some kind of, military answer, a nationalistic appeal that, it doesn't give me the comfort I wish it would give me to know that the Chinese model in the long run, or maybe even in the medium run, can't succeed. Everything you say is right. What its relevance is to the struggle that we're talking about here between democracy and authoritarianism, I don't know when it becomes relevant in a way that makes me happy.
Bob, let me ask you about the European Parliament elections. You've lived in Europe. You've written a famous piece about the Mars and Venus aspect of this. Europe has been a strong partner with us in promoting democracy and human rights in various parts of the world. How worried are you about where Europe itself, whether you call it old Europe, new Europe, the whole continent, where is it going?
Europe has become increasingly inward-looking. This was true even before the economic crisis. This wave of fundamentally sort of anti-immigration sentiment that is fueling a lot of these right-wing parties was already visible when the French voted against the EU Constitution when they did, which was mostly about not letting Turkey in. I mean, this trend has been building for a while. I continue to have the following element of faith in the EU, which is that the EU was not built ultimately on economic requirements, and it was not built ultimately on the need for unity and all those wonderful things. It was built on the rubble of World War II and World War I and the very powerful desire of Europeans never to return to that situation again. I think that sentiment is still very strong in Europe. It's strong to the point that it makes them less helpful to us in some ways. I mean, the country that matters most in Europe by any conceivable measure is Germany. Whatever else is going on in Europe, Germany is not turning away from this kind of postmodern approach to the world, this sort of post-war look at which means that Europe and Germany are not going to be effective partners as we go out. But I also believe that there is this very powerful sentiment in Germany and in Europe will keep Europe from blowing up into nationalist trends, and that what we're seeing is, a phase, but it's not the last phase. That's my judgment.
But in some countries, would you say that democracy is in real trouble?
Well, I mean,
where we thought they sort of got past the hurdles.
I'm more concerned about Hungary than I am about other countries, obviously.
What about Greece?
And Greece. Yeah, but I think that, again, I think that as long as, I mean, it is, I don't want to say that, I don't want to be deterministic about this.
Right.
If the member states of the EU and the United States turn a blind eye to non-democratic government movements, I mean, you can't do anything about parties winning elections, right. But insofar as governments are becoming less democratic, they should be punished, ostracized, if we want to keep it going. Because again, I would say Greece is not a country where you would say that is just a natural democracy, which left on its own will just be a democracy. That country needs to be anchored in a democratic system where the other partners are keeping a close eye on it. And I think that's probably going to turn out to be true for more than one country in Europe. And what I find troubling is the degree to which we don't really want to pay that much attention and hold these countries to account. And that is worrying.
There's a question over here. Now we have questions as we're running out of time. So we'll take one here, Keith, and then there if we have time, and we'll wrap up.
Keith Berner from Freedom House. My question is going back to the impact of the U.S. domestic situation on our foreign policy. You make a very strong case for the indispensability of the U.S. in the international system, and I think a case can be made that the American people have to be behind it for the U.S. to play an active role. And I wonder if you're concerned at all about recent trends toward concentration of economic power and greater inequality within this country, coupled with recent Supreme Court decisions that also seem to increase political power in the hands of the most wealthy in this country, and whether that could sap the American will to play an idealistic role in the world.
Let's try, if they're quick, we'll take 2 more here. I saw it. Okay.
Hi, Dominic Ballone, American University. Back to Egypt, sorry. How do you feel that, like, weapons sales, what kind of message does that send about our support for democracy when we're also sending millions or billions of dollars of military aid to Egypt and even certain Gulf states?
Great. Right there. Yep. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Elise Hampton. I don't have an affiliation right now, but I do have a question. I'm listening to your historical account of the United States' power and influence in the modern world, so to speak, and the cycle of retrenchment and isolationism and interventionism and then activism. And what I'm beginning to wonder is, outside of crisis mode, do we have a grand strategy?
All right.
See, even people without affiliations can ask really good questions. I just want you all to take note of that. Well, thank you. That's a good group of questions. I mean, this is a purely like a pragmatic answer, which is I don't know what the correlation is between income inequality and foreign policy. I can't even say that there's a one-to-one correlation of a simplistic variety that people would expect, for instance, between economic downturns and foreign policy. The example I always like to use is, the two examples are, in the 1920s, you had a booming economy and a fundamentally anti-interventionist country. In the late 1970s, you had a disastrous economy with stagflation and high unemployment, and a country that basically was throwing Jimmy Carter out on his ear for not being tough enough in the world and electing Ronald Reagan. So, you know, I don't think there's obviously some correlation with economic issues. On the inequality front, I just don't know. And on the sort of, in a more general sense, on the sort of incapacity of U.S. government, all the failings of the U.S. government, I mean, we've been there. We've been through this many, many times. American government has often been failing in one way or another to solve major problems. But again, I don't see a correlation between that and foreign policy. And partly the reason is foreign policy, as we know, is such an executive branch activity that, and it's not an activity that Americans vote on by and large, except in the most general sense. Maybe until now, and we'll see. We'll see. I'm predicting that the two candidates in the 2016 election will both be, generally speaking, internationalists, not isolationists, which means that'll tell you something. That'll be part of an answer to your question. So, on Egypt, the simple answer is yes. One of the most astonishing things about Egypt, setting aside what you may or may not think about what the right policy is, our aid package to Egypt has not changed practically by $1 through 4 successive different types of government. It's basically the structure that was in place when Mubarak was in office. So we've gone from Mubarak to the revolution against Mubarak, to the SCAF, to Morsi, to the military coup. And the one thing that you can always count on is not only that American aid will be coming, but it's going to be coming in exactly the same structure. I mean, really, can that possibly be? So what signal are we sending? We're sending we don't care about democracy in Egypt. Thank you. That's a very simple message that we are sending. Now, again, we can argue about whether we should care, and Ira and I can take this argument and go on and have it for the next 5 years, but in terms of what signal we're sending, then that's definitely the signal we're sending, and that's the way it is. And you asked me this brilliant question, and the nub of your brilliant question
Grand
was...
strategy.
Pardon?
Grand strategy.
Grand strategy. Do we have a grand strategy? I mean, no, we don't. We could, we should. I tried to outline what it ought to be simply by borrowing from the grand strategy that I think Roosevelt laid out in the middle of World War II, which was I think our grand strategy should be to preserve this liberal world order. That's what grand strategy means, because then you'll say, well, what does that mean and how do you do it? That's strategy, and then what do you do in this country? That's tactics. But grand strategy should be defending the liberal world order. And I think that we confused ourselves during the Cold War into thinking that containment was our grand strategy. So that when the Soviet Union went away, then we went from having a grand strategy of containment to having no grand strategy. In truth, the way I look at it, containment was a strategy for implementing the grand strategy of supporting a liberal world order that was in America's interests and conducive to American values. And therefore, and what that meant during the time of the Soviet Union was containment. Now it means something else. Now it means we deal with China in this way, we deal with Russia in that way, we support Europe in this way, we deal with Egypt in that way. It's got all these varying qualities. But I think your point is well taken in the sense that absent this sort of unifying existential threat that we thought, I think probably more than was actually true, was represented by the Soviet Union and communism, in the absence of that, we have no grand strategy. And I think, we've been living off the sort of intellectual fumes of that Cold War grand strategy. But my concern, and that's what this piece is about to some extent, is that it's becoming increasingly apparent that doesn't answer the question in the current world. And we're going to have to answer that question. Otherwise, we are just going to be, drifting.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Bob Kagan.
And Joe Joffe.
And particularly if Joe is watching us on live stream, Joe, thanks very much to you and a speedy recovery.